I got very interested in looking for stories in real life, looking at real characters, real people and their problems, their issues, their successes. And I noticed that real life has very interesting stories to tell, and doing that I can make other people learn or change attitudes. Who am I? Am I an academic? Am I an activist? Am I a filmmaker? So I see myself as a social scientist who uses filmmaking and uses activism to do positive social impact, to change the attitudes of people towards, for example, disability, towards other marginalized groups. So activism is something that came to me through a film I made with a colleague in Zanzibar, Zanzibar Soccer Queens and Zanzibar Soccer Dreams. These were two films that we made in Zanzibar about Muslim women playing football. And the aim was to break stereotypes of African women and how they are portrayed in Western media, which is usually very stereotypical. And the first film was shown in festivals and it had a lot of social impact. Someone who watched the film, they invited the team to Germany to go on a whole tour and receive a lot of gifts. The second film had the impact of a partnership between Potsdam and Zanzibar, and there were again many donations, so they had a lot of social impact. And I realized that I actually want to make films that have social impact, not just films for the sake of making films. And this is where the activist component came. And thus I started making documentaries that have activist purposes, but at the same time they can also be shown to mainstream audiences. So I don't make short activist films that are only used by charities. I want to make documentaries that can engage large audiences and at the same time send a message about marginalized groups and reducing prejudice. Filmmaking is very nerve-wracking because you deal with real people, you deal with logistics, with light, with composition, with framing and technology, a lot of obstacles. But then on the other hand, it's very experiential because you get a lot of experience through dealing with people and you have a lived experience. Writing is the other way around. It's a practice that has no obstacles. You can let your ideas flourish and come up with new frameworks and concepts. You have a lot of control, but at the same time it's not the same as lived experience. I thoroughly enjoy writing, maybe sometimes more than filmmaking, and then I really enjoy to take my writing and put it into practice through my films. And then after I make my films, I like again to write about them and to conceptualize what I did into frameworks. So it's a kind of perpetual process of one informing the other, where it's a synergy between the two, and it's basically the concept of research-led practice, where research through writing informs the practice, practice informs the research, and so forth. If you are passionate about something, whatever it is, you make sacrifices. I do make sacrifices, but I think that people should learn to have a better work-life balance. And that's the one thing I like about the Austrians, that they know how to enjoy life and they don't sacrifice their life for work. Whilst the British people, they are complete workaholics, and you fall into this pattern of constant work and no rest and mental health. That's why there are so many psychotherapists in the UK. So yeah, this is the book that's appeared in my film with a blind paint, the terrorist fragments, exactly. So I made a film about him in 2004 for my MA. The film was quite successful in festivals, but I realized that it was very stereotypical and I didn't portray him in a very good way. It was all about him being the hero and overcoming his disability. Because of that, I wanted to make something longer about him, because I realized that I can do a longer film about him and something which represents him in a less stereotypical way. So he became one of the subjects of my PhD work, where I did all this research on stigma and blindness stereotypes and how they can be deconstructed, and I applied this to a longer documentary about him, which came out in 2016. So between 4 and 6 years sporadically, I visited him and filmed him, and we got a good relationship. him wanting to be filmed, me filming as much as possible with him every year. So it was a very long process of filming. It's a choice, but it also depends on the genre. If you look at ethnographic documentaries, they usually take more time to film because it's linked to ethnographic research. The filmmaker needs to live with the communities and needs to understand them better, and these can take months or years to make. Other documentaries, like current affair documentaries for television or newscasts, they take much shorter to make. They don't have enough time. It's a very fast turnaround. The most interesting thing is that he was very mischievous. He didn't like the fact that me, a seeing filmmaker, I'm not blind myself, film him, a blind person. So he started to make fun of this power dynamic, this power relationship. And he started to, in a very playful way, sabotage the filmmaking process. So he would look into the camera, he would talk to the audience, he would make references to me and my filmmaking and complain about having to be filmed at hours when he wants to enjoy his privacy. And
but he was ironic, right?
Half and half. He was ironic, half and half. No, he enjoyed the process, but he wanted to play and he wanted to turn around this power relationship. And the biggest moment of embodying this dynamic was when I started filming him painting, and he was listening to music. He always listened to music when he was painting, but I asked him to turn off the music because in documentary, when you film something with music in the background, when you cut it afterwards, you will have a lot of jump cuts. So for continuity's sake, you usually try and turn off background music. So I asked him to do that and he didn't agree. So why should he paint without music? Because he always uses music, it relaxes him, and he doesn't like silence when he paints. So I had to explain to him the whole process about continuity and how editing works and why I need him to do that. And then he reluctantly agreed to do it. But I have this entire conversation on camera and it's in the film. And also he was moving along a lot around, so with headphones he would have been a bit uncomfortable. Throughout the film it became a running joke where he always makes fun of continuity and of documentary editing, and always asking me how am I going to edit this together if there was any kind of noise in the background. And I kept these moments in the film because I wanted the audience to understand that there's a power relationship there that he's trying to subvert a bit. He was very happy with the movie. He actually asked me to come back and film him more. So even though he turned around this power relationship a bit, he actually liked the attention and he liked to be filmed and he liked the social interaction with me. And we developed a strange, playful bond of trust and teasing each other. He has passed away now, so I can't film him anymore. But I have a lot of footage of him which I could make into a different film. What I made back then in 2004 was very stereotypical, and that actually portrayed him in a way that maintains the stigma of disability, because he was portrayed as this hero, and in disability studies it's called a super crip stereotype, and where people exoticize the disabled person as being very heroic and being almost a supernatural being. And I wanted to change this, and this is where my drive for activism came. Maybe I also experienced myself prejudice when I went from Romania to Austria, and Eastern Europeans are very much stigmatized in Austria, and then they're also stigmatized in the UK, where Romanian people don't have a very good reputation. So I think this encountering of prejudice and negative attitudes was also that made me aware that it's something I want to change in people. It's about culture, it's about this the former East Bloc, the former countries behind the Iron Curtain, and yes, basically that Romanians are incapable and not advanced, and there are a lot of orphans here, and basically being seen as inferior in the UK and in Austria. And I think this lived experience of prejudice also triggered something in me about being eager to make a positive social change in relation to disability. I think the ECR does great work. having all the UNESCO concerts and plays and the former film festival, the Romanian, which was organized by Ramona Mitrică, for instance. So I went to that, but I think they need to do more promotion outside the Romanian community. I don't think many British people know about it. I organized with a colleague a big event there about prejudice, about attitudes, about being homesick. And yes, the consensus was that we need to improve our presence in the UK, but our presence as different type of Romanians, not the stereotypical Romanian. I define creativity in quite a specific way, because creativity is a very loose term. What creativity means for me is not just making the film, but conceptualizing films. So for me, creativity starts on paper, reading books, looking at different theoretical models. So for example, now I'm using a lot of models from social psychology, how to reduce prejudice and stigma. I'm using models from media studies about how aesthetics can generate, for example, emotions in audiences. I use models from activism, how to create social impact. And all these models I combine in a very creative way and try to tailor-make a kind of hybrid framework that I applied in my film. So for me, the first and maybe most important layer of creativity is the theory of putting together different methodologies and understanding what I'm going to make the film about and why am I going to make the film. And then the second layer of creativity is how to put this into practice with the film, how to conceptualize interviews, how to think about composition, about light, and all these things. And these two layers of creativity are very different in terms of financing. The first layer is not really, you don't really money for it because you can have access to a lot of knowledge. The research stage, exactly. The second layer is more costly because you have equipment, you have transport, travel and accommodation, these kind of things. So I think that there's no barrier to conceptualizing documentary filmmaking. There's maybe barriers to actually making the documentaries. At the same time, nowadays, with equipment becoming cheaper and the internet giving a lot of opportunities for exhibiting films like on social media, a lot more people can afford to make films. So I think this obstacle of financing when it comes to the new form of documentary, which is mostly made for online consumption and for online communities, has really enabled people to not require a lot of funding for documentary. Obviously, the more traditional documentaries that are shown in cinemas, feature-length documentaries, they require funding, of course, but I'm departing from that kind of documentary form into more online documentaries that can reach a far wider audience than if they're in a festival or if they are on TV, for instance. So I think now this creativity doesn't have limits from the finances. I will give you an example of a Russian documentary by Viktor Kosakovsky called Tishe, where he filmed his street from his window mostly within a whole year. And he edited it on iMovie, which was a free software from Apple, and the film hardly cost him anything, but he won a lot of prizes. It was shown in festivals, and it told us a lot about Russian culture and Russian people in 2003. So I think people shouldn't be put down by the logistical and equipment limitations and really look at the concepts of filmmaking, because we need to think about why we make films, how we make films, not just the making of the films. My documentaries, I used to send them to film festivals, and they were shown especially by disability film festivals. But now I've moved to an area where I don't send them to festivals. They are more used for community screenings. And I find community screenings very flexible, more so than film festivals, because you can invite a community that you want to target. For example, people with disabilities or clinicians. If I want to show them my film about blindness and for them to learn how to treat people with visual impairment, I can have a target audience of clinicians. So I think for me it's very much about target audiences and being very specific about in which audience segments, I want to change attitudes. So for example, the Terry fragments, I screened it with audio description to an audience of blind people, and it was very interesting to hear their feedback, because some liked it, some didn't like it, and they told me why they didn't like it, and things like that. And then the next stage would be to screen it to clinicians and see how they are impacted by seeing this lived experience, because clinicians usually treat blind people in a very sterile and clinical way, and my film is supposed to show them the lived experience of blind people. But I haven't come around to do this yet. That's the next stage. Through my students, I see a lot of examples of people being very precious about their films, and I think that's the wrong thing to do. And I also worked a long time as an editor, and as an editor you have to be prepared to kill your darlings. So what you shot, even if it took you ages to shoot and you're very precious about it, if it doesn't fit in the edit, and the edit creates the narrative that then the audience sees, then you have to kill it, you have to take it out. So through editing I learned to be quite ruthless with my own filmmaking and with my rushes, and to think about, okay, what matters in the end is what I communicate to the audience, not what I shot and what I'm precious about. And I think this really helped me to detach myself a bit. Obviously everyone is attached to it, it's impossible. And when I got negative feedback about my films, of course I was emotionally affected, but I'm trying not to be. And as a social scientist, there's always this kind of reflexivity about when you do something, you look at it and you see what has been done wrong, how can it be improved. There's a constant cycle of improvement, which is why I like audience screenings. I screen it to audiences, get their feedback and see, did they really get my message or not? What can I do different? So for example, the documentaries I made, like the Terry fragments, now looking back at them, I think I could have done much better in the approach, because the films are quite experimental, which means that it's more for a niche audience. Nowadays I would make the films completely differently, but that's all based on more reading and more feedback from people. So I think because I'm constantly trying to self-improve, I'm trying not to be too precious about my films. Maybe my engineering background helped, because as an engineer you have to be very planned, trying to predict as much as possible. And of course we know documentary making, real life is unpredictable sometimes. But if you do your research, if you meet your characters, spend some time with them without filming, you get to know them, and you can have certain expectations. And that is very calming to know, okay, when I go to film you in this situation, I know this will happen, or it's these possibilities, and this calms me down to plan and to know more or less what's going to happen. But I agree with you that it's very nerve-wracking to make documentaries, and sometimes something happens that is completely unexpected. But it can also lead to positive results. I'm trying not to lose my temper. I'm usually self-composed, and I think that's because as a lecturer you can't lose your temper, so you have to perform and be self-composed. And naturally I think I'm also quite mellow. I don't usually lose my temper very easily. Well, I'm collaborating with many universities for research, but the actual teaching my main teaching is at Bournemouth University, and then I do part-time teaching at Open City, which is at University College London, every Tuesday evening. So it started in 2007, but I didn't intend to be a teacher. I worked as a documentary editor, and I did some part-time teaching to basically to earn more money, and I taught editing. And I really enjoyed the teaching. I enjoyed the university context, because this was at the University of South Wales. And I got more and more into academia, not just teaching but also research, like writing articles for instance. And at some point I gave up my documentary editing job and went full-time into academia. I always liked teaching. I remember even when I did my engineering college as a student, I loved presenting to other people, and I loved me learning new things and then imparting that knowledge to other people so they can learn from it as well, and simplifying things for different audiences, making knowledge more accessible. I always loved doing this. I like teaching people who are 18, 19, 20, so late teenagers, to the transition to young adulthood, because I think for me that's the best age. because it means that they are old enough to be mature and to understand abstract ideas, but at the same time they are still malleable and they still are information, and they don't have fossilized ideas about the world, and they can learn new things and form themselves. So I really like this age, this transitional age. At Open City the feedback is usually good, but these are adult students. They're not late age teenagers. At university the feedback is split, because I tend to be quite strict, and the students who are lazy, they don't like me. And the ones who are very passionate and want to learn, they really like me because I give them a lot of support and sometimes even mentorship. So if I see that they are passionate and they make an effort, I give them a lot. If I see that they are lazy, then I don't give them as much. So the course you did at Open City, documentary storytelling, actually started in 2007, and back then it was called the art of film editing. It was all about editing and storytelling, and then
It was by you.
yeah. So I wrote it, and it evolved into documentary storytelling. And of course my research on stigma and stereotypes and activism fed into it, so it kept changing, it kept evolving. It was always in person. It only started becoming online in 2020-21 with COVID. And there were two main differences I noticed. One is that through not being in a real classroom, you lose a lot of this phenomenological experience, the somatic experience of seeing people's bodies moving around, interacting with them in breaks. So for example, after the last session we always went to the pub to socialize and to talk. You can't do this online. Also in the real classroom you don't just see the slides like on Zoom, for instance. You see the slides being produced by the computer, the projector, you see the microphone of the teacher talking, so everything is much more haptic, and you have a much more haptic idea of things and how things are produced. And I think you appreciate it more. Whilst on Zoom it suddenly comes up and is completely abstract. So online really loses this kind of hapticity and somatic experience and the appreciation for how knowledge is produced and accessed. But at the same time, you are absolutely right that it's incredibly democratic and it allows access from people all over the world. So since we switched from in-person to online classes, we had a surge in students. It doubled up or tripled sometimes. So now we have much more students from all over the world, from Saudi Arabia, Australia, which is wonderful because people have better access, and it's also better for people with disabilities who can't very easily, who are not mobile. One of the most positive aspects of COVID was accessibility for disabled people online, which is really, really good. Now it's more inclusive.
Do you have a particular example?
Yes, for example, a lot of concerts and theatre plays were put online during COVID, which before they weren't. Like the Barbican in London showed films online, the National Film Theatre showed films online, and this enabled much more disabled people to have access to these things, where before they didn't. And luckily after COVID this practice was kept. I think it really depends on what kind of films you want to make, and it also depends on how much you want to experiment with art and film and how much you want to have a good quality of life, paying rents, eating well, and these kind of things. So I'm not a person who would sacrifice their life for my filmmaking. I want to live well, I want to eat well, I want to do sports, I want to go to the gym, doing these kind of things, and I would never sacrifice this for my filmmaking. So I'm trying to keep a good work-life balance. So with my students, I always tell them, when I see that they're very ambitious to make their film, I say, have breaks, have rest, socialize with your crews. Life is short. Don't just be completely focused on filmmaking, because this also brings you lived experiences. If you socialize with people, you learn more about people, and this will also make you better filmmakers. For example, when I go jogging, sometimes I have an idea that improves my filmmaking or my publications.